My grandmother's engagement ring was the first thing I noticed when my mother raised her hand to quiet the room. She was wearing it. She had no right to be wearing it. That ring was supposed to be mine. I felt it before I understood it. A cold recognition settling into my chest like winter through a cracked window. Around me, my sister's engagement party hummed with chatter and champagne. White roses everywhere. My mother loved white roses. She said they meant purity. I always thought they just meant expense. She tapped her glass with a silver spoon, and the backyard fell quiet. 47 guests turned toward her. My father stood just behind her left shoulder, the way he always positioned himself, close enough to take credit, far enough to deny involvement. My mother smiled her practiced smile, the one that reached her eyes just slightly less than it should. "To our beautiful daughter," she said, looking at my sister, "and to her wonderful future with Daniel." And here she paused, and I felt my stomach drop before she even continued, "to the most generous gift a sister could give. Our oldest has agreed to transfer Grandma Ruth's property on Clover Lane to the happy couple as a wedding present." The applause started immediately. I hadn't agreed to anything. I set my champagne flute down so carefully it didn't make a sound, and I looked across the yard at my mother, who was already looking back at me, still smiling, daring me with her eyes to say something. I did. "No," I said. The word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Our house always looked better from the outside. My father built his reputation the same way he built his real estate portfolio, carefully, publicly, and with other people's money whenever possible. He had a firm handshake and a firm opinion about everything, and he delivered both with the same confidence. He called it vision. I grew up understanding it was control, wearing a nicer suit. My mother was the interpreter of that control. She translated my father's expectations into softer language, suggestions, requests, the gentle implication that doing what she asked was simply what good daughters did. She could make a demand sound like a favor she was doing you. It took me years to stop feeling grateful for it. My sister was 11 months younger than me, and had always understood, on some animal level, that she was the preferred one. Not cruelly, not consciously. She simply occupied the center of every family photograph the way some people occupy space, completely, without apology. My parents called her spirited. I called her the reason I learned to disappear. Grandma Ruth was different. She had outlived one husband, one recession, and one breast cancer diagnosis, and she carried all three of those survivals the way some women carry jewelry. Quietly, close to the skin, only visible when the light hit right. She lived alone in a house on Clover Lane for 30 years after my grandfather passed. 3 bedrooms, a garden that she tended like a second child, a screened porch where she kept a rocking chair, and a stack of library books and a pot of coffee that was always ready. When I was 12, she sat with me on that porch and said, "The world will tell you that being easy to love is the most important thing. Don't believe it. Be honest instead. Honest people are harder to trick." I didn't fully understand her then. I do now. She passed 2 years before my sister's engagement party, and she left the house on Clover Lane to me. Just me. Not split, not shared. Mine outright, in a will that had been drawn up by a probate attorney named Gerald Marsh, who had an office in town, and, as I would eventually learn, a very clear memory for details. My parents were named co-executors of the estate. That was the part I hadn't thought carefully enough about. The first hint came about 8 months after the funeral. I was 26, living in an apartment across town, finishing the last semester of my graduate program in education. I stopped by Clover Lane to check on the house. I hadn't had time to deal with it yet, and I felt guilty every time I drove past and didn't stop. The garden was dead. Not neglected dead. Renewed dead. The raised beds my grandmother had built herself were gone, replaced with a flat stretch of sod. The porch furniture was different. There was a car in the driveway I didn't recognize, and through the front window I could see light and movement. Someone was living there. I found out from a neighbor, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Aldridge, who lived 2 houses down and had known my grandmother for 20 years, that my parents had been renting the property since the month after the funeral. She said she'd seen a young couple moving boxes in. She said she'd assumed I knew. I called my father that night. He didn't apologize. He didn't even pause. "We're managing the asset," he said. "You weren't doing anything with it. The rental income is being held in a family account. We'll sort it out eventually." "It's my property," I said. "It's your grandmother's legacy," he said, as though that were a correction. "We're protecting it." I should have pushed harder then. I know that now. Instead, I said I wanted to discuss it in person, and he said, of course. And then 3 weeks passed, and he found reasons to reschedule every time I brought it up, so I started keeping records. I didn't fully know why. Some quiet instinct. Maybe Grandma Ruth's voice in the back of my mind. Honest people are harder to trick. Told me to be careful. I requested documentation from the county recorder's office. I asked Gerald Marsh's office for a copy of my grandmother's will. I kept every text message. I wrote dates and amounts in a notebook I kept in my desk drawer at work. Month by month, I built a picture I hadn't wanted to see. The rental income was not in any account I had access to. The tenants paid $1,500 a month. 18 months of tenancy meant $27,000. When I finally got a partial accounting from my father, not a full one, never a full one, it showed property maintenance deductions that didn't match any receipts I could locate. My grandmother's ring disappeared from the estate inventory around the same time my mother started wearing it. By the time my sister got engaged, I had a folder on my laptop containing photographs, bank statements I'd obtained through a formal records request, 3 emails from my father referencing family property management in language that would not hold up to scrutiny, and a letter I'd drafted but not yet sent to Gerald Marsh's office. I was waiting for the right moment. My mother gave it to me at my sister's engagement party. The silence after I said no lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then my mother laughed, a bright, social laugh, the kind she deployed like a pressure release valve. "She's being modest," she told the guests. "We'll talk about the details later." She raised her glass again, and most people raised theirs, and the moment tried to close over like water. I picked up my glass from the table. I did not raise it. My father appeared at my elbow almost immediately, his voice low and entirely pleasant. "This isn't the time." "You made it the time," I said. "We'll discuss it inside." "I'd rather discuss why you announced a decision I never made." He steered me, not roughly, but with the practiced firmness of someone who had been redirecting me since childhood, toward the back door of the house. I went because 47 people were watching, and I hadn't decided yet what I wanted them to see. Inside, the kitchen was quiet. My mother followed us in. She closed the door behind her and turned to me with an expression I recognized, patient, faintly disappointed, already composing the version of this conversation she would tell people later. "This is a significant moment for your sister," she said. "We thought you thought I'd go along with it," I said. "Because I always go along with it. It's a house," my father said. "You're not even living in it, because you've been renting it without my permission." Something shifted in his face. Not guilt. He wasn't capable of that, not quickly, but a recalibration, a reassessment of how much I knew. We've been maintaining an asset that would have sat empty for $27,000 in rental income that I'd never seen. The kitchen went very quiet. My mother set her glass down. "Where did you get that number? From a records request? And from your own emails? And from Gerald Marsh, who is going to be very interested in a few things I've been collecting." My father's voice dropped to something quieter than a shout, which was always worse. "You went to an attorney." "Not yet," I said. "I was giving you a chance to be honest with me first. You don't threaten your own family." "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm telling you I won't sign the house over to my sister. I'm telling you the rental income needs to be accounted for. And I'm telling you," I didn't finish the sentence. He moved fast for someone his size, not a punch. "I want to be precise about what happened because I spent a long time being precise about it afterward." He grabbed my arm and shoved me backward, and the edge of the kitchen counter caught my ribs, and my head hit the cabinet, and then I was on the floor, and everything was a smear of white light, and the sound of my mother saying my name in a tone I'd never heard from her before, sharp and frightened. And then, nothing. The emergency room at St. Catherine's Medical Center smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. I lay on a narrow bed behind a curtain and stared at the acoustic tiles overhead and tried to count the holes in them to keep myself calm. A nurse named Priya took my vitals and asked me routine questions and then Gently, she asked me how I'd gotten the bruising on my left arm and the contusion on the back of my skull. I hesitated. She didn't push. She wrote something down and said a doctor would be in shortly and that I should rest. When she left, I turned my head carefully and looked at my phone. The screen was cracked across one corner. It had skidded across the kitchen tile when I fell. There were 4 missed calls from my mother. A text from my sister that said what happened. Mom said you fell. I put the phone face down on the tray table. I didn't fall. A doctor came and went. A radiology technician came and went. The verdict was a mild concussion, 2 bruised ribs, significant soft tissue bruising on my left arm consistent with forceful grip, and a recommendation that I not be alone for the next 24 hours. When the attending physician asked if I was safe to go home, I said, "I'm not going home." She nodded in the careful way that people nod when they already understand the situation. She called a social worker. The social worker's name was Patricia. She was maybe 50, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen everything and judged nothing. She sat in the plastic chair beside my bed and asked me questions in a low, even voice, and she listened to every answer. When I finished, she said, "Do you have anyone you can call?" I thought for a moment. Mrs. Aldridge. I had her number because she'd given it to me that afternoon. I'd shown up at Clover Lane and found strangers living in my grandmother's house. She'd pressed it into my hand and said, "If you ever need anything, dear, your grandmother was a good woman and she spoke highly of you." I called her at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. She answered on the second ring. She didn't ask questions. She said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes," and she was. Mrs. Aldridge drove a very clean Ford Taurus and kept mints in the center console and did not say a word about my appearance the entire drive to her house. She had a guest room with a quilt on the bed that smelled like cedar and lavender, and she set a glass of water on the nightstand and said, "Sleep. We'll figure out tomorrow in the morning." I couldn't sleep for a long time. I lay in the dark with my ribs aching and my phone on the pillow beside me, and I thought about my grandmother on the porch on Clover Lane with her coffee and her books. I thought about the way she'd said honest people are harder to trick. I thought about the folder on my laptop. At some point before dawn, I opened my email. I had Gerald Marsh's address saved from the letter I drafted and never sent. I wrote a new one. I explained what had happened. The rental income, the ring, the announcement at the party, the kitchen, the hospital. I attached the photographs and the bank statements and the 3 emails from my father. I attached my discharge papers from St. Catherine's. In the subject line, I wrote, "My grandmother's will. I think she knew I might need help." I hit send and closed my laptop. Then, for the first time since I was 12 years old, sitting on a porch swing in the late afternoon, I felt something I could only call my grandmother's presence. Not ghostly, not mystical, just the memory of her voice, steady and certain, like the smell of coffee and old books. I closed my eyes and let the darkness hold me until it turned gray. Gerald Marsh called at 8:47 the next morning. He had a deliberate voice, the kind that had probably been deliberate for 40 years, careful with words the way craftsmen are careful with tools. He said he was sorry to hear what had happened. He said he had reviewed my email and the attachments. He said there were several things I needed to understand. The house on Clover Lane had been left to me in fee simple, complete unconditional ownership. My parents' role as co-executors of the estate had ended by the terms of the will the moment the deed transfer was formally recorded. They had retained access to the property by presenting themselves to the tenants as my representatives, which was, he said, a misrepresentation at minimum and potentially fraud. "The rental income," I said, "will need to be fully accounted for," he said, "with interest. And the ring." A pause. "Your grandmother's ring was itemized as a specific bequest to you in the will. If it was removed from the estate inventory, that's a separate matter." I pressed my phone harder against my ear. What do I do? First, I'm going to contact the county recorder's office and confirm the deed status. Second, I'm going to request a formal accounting from your parents of all financial activity related to the property since your grandmother's passing. Third, and this is important, I want you to file a police report today. For last night, he said. I know that's difficult. But the medical documentation you already have is significant. and if this proceeds legally, which I think it should, you'll want a record." I looked out Mrs. Aldridge's guest room window at her small backyard, at the bird feeder she'd hung from a shepherd's hook, at the ordinary morning light. I thought about the version of myself who had spent years keeping the peace, who had said I'll bring it up next time, who had said they don't mean it that way, who had chosen the path of least resistance so many times it had worn grooves in her. "Okay," I said. "I'll file the report." Officer Chen was younger than I expected and older in her manner than her years. She took my statement at a table in the police department's public lobby, writing carefully, asking precise follow-up questions. When I finished, she said the responding team would follow up within 24 hours, and that given the medical documentation, there was sufficient basis for further investigation. She gave me a case number and a card. When I walked back out into the morning, Mrs. Bettis Aldridge was waiting in her Taurus with the engine running and 2 coffees in the cup holder. "You did the hard thing," she said simply. "It didn't feel hard," I said. "It just felt like the next step." That afternoon, Gerald Marsh called back. He had spoken with a civil litigation associate at his firm. The financial irregularities surrounding the property, the unauthorized rental, the missing income, the inventory discrepancy, constituted a prima facie case of breach of fiduciary duty and estate fraud. They were prepared to move. 3 days later, my parents received formal legal correspondence. I was not there to see them read it. I didn't need to be. The meeting happened on a Thursday. Gerald Marsh's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, all quiet carpeting and dark wood and the smell of paper and old decisions. I sat in a chair across from the conference table and watched the door. My parents arrived 8 minutes late. My father was wearing his best jacket, the navy one he wore to client meetings, which told me he understood the severity and was still trying to perform his way through it. My mother had her hair done. She looked at me when she came in, and her expression did something complicated, something that moved through several emotions too quickly for me to track. My sister was not there. That was her choice, and I respected it. My father sat down. He didn't look at Gerald Marsh. He looked at me. "We can talk about this like adults," he said. "We are," I said. Gerald Marsh opened his folder. He was not a man who wasted time on atmosphere. He laid out the facts the way you'd lay out evidence, methodically, without malice, in a sequence that left no room for reinterpretation. 18 months of unauthorized tenancy, $31,200 in rental income received and not remitted to the property owner, accounting for a small maintenance disbursement that could be verified. 3 instances of my father representing himself as property manager to the tenants in writing. 1 item of personal jewelry, a diamond solitaire in a platinum setting, appraised at $8,400 removed from the estate inventory prior to distribution. My father said we were managing a family asset. Gerald Marsh said, "You were managing your daughter's asset without her knowledge or consent." "The legal distinction is significant," my mother said softly. "We never meant for it to become, we thought it was temporary." $31,000 over 18 months is not temporary, Gerald Marsh said. He wasn't unkind about it. He just stated it the way you state facts. My father's jaw tightened. He looked at me then, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not calculation, but something smaller and sadder than either of those. Something that might have been the beginning of understanding what he'd done, or might have just been the recognition that it hadn't worked. "What does she want?" he asked, as though I weren't in the room. "I'm right here," I said. He looked at me. "I want the full rental income accounted for and returned," I said. "I want the ring back, and I want the property free and clear. No management, no access, nothing, effective immediately." "And," he said, he knew there was more. "And the criminal matter is separate. That's not mine to negotiate." My mother made a small sound. She pressed her fingers to her lips. "The assault," my father started. "The assault is documented," Gerald Marsh said. "The police report is filed. That process is independent of these proceedings." My father sat back in his chair. He looked, for possibly the first time in my memory, like a man who had run out of moves. My mother turned to me then. Her eyes were bright, and for a moment she looked genuinely like my mother. Not the performed version, not the decorator of illusions, but the woman underneath all of it. "I never wanted it to go this far," she said. "I know," I said, and I meant it. I believed she hadn't wanted it to go this far. I just also believed she had made every choice that brought it here. I stood up. "I'd like the ring before I leave today," I said. "I know you have it with you. You wore it to my sister's engagement party, and you'd want it for something like this." My mother's hand moved to her right hand, where the ring sat on her fourth finger. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she slid it off and set it on the conference table between us. I picked it up. It was smaller than I remembered from childhood, when it had seemed enormous and glittering on my grandmother's hand. Now it just felt like metal and weight, and something that had been taken from me that I was finally holding again. I put it in my pocket. "Thank you," I said. I walked out first. Gerald Marsh followed. Behind us, the conference room was very quiet. The house on Clover Lane was empty by the end of the month. The tenants had been on a month-to-month lease. My parents had kept it that way, Gerald Marsh noted, probably for flexibility. And they moved out with no drama and no hard feelings toward me. The woman who'd been living there left a note on the kitchen counter that said she hoped the house would be loved. I stood in the empty kitchen and read it twice. I got the keys made the same afternoon. I didn't move in right away. I wasn't ready for that yet. But I came every few days and walked through the rooms, relearning them. The bones of the house were exactly as my grandmother had left them. The wide plank floors, the window seat in the second bedroom, the screened porch with its view of what had been the garden. I planted things slowly. I wasn't my grandmother. I didn't have her patience or her instinct for it. But I bought seed packets from the hardware store, and I dug beds, and I made mistakes, and I kept going. The legal process moved the way legal processes do, steadily, impersonally, and without caring how anyone felt about it. My parents agreed to a civil settlement, the full rental income plus interest, $34,000 and change, transferred to my account in 2 installments. My father accepted a conditional plea in the criminal matter, no jail time, a fine, mandatory counseling, and a restraining order that established formal distance between his household and mine. My sister texted me the day the settlement was finalized. She said, "I don't know what to say." I didn't know about all of it. I believed her about most of it. I wrote back, "I know. I hope things go well with the wedding." She replied with a small heart emoji. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was something. My grandmother had a habit of writing things in the margins of her books. I found them when I finally went through the boxes in the second bedroom closet, penciled notes, underlines, small question marks beside passages that had made her think. In a battered copy of a novel I didn't recognize, on the flyleaf in her small, slanted handwriting, I found a sentence that stopped me cold. She had written, "The things we protect quietly protect us back." I stood in the closet for a long time, holding the book. I thought about the folder on my laptop, the records request, the emails, the notebook in my desk drawer. The letter I'd drafted and hesitated over for months. I thought about how I hadn't fully known why I was collecting it. Just a quiet instinct, a whisper from somewhere I couldn't name. She had put a clause in her will. Gerald Marsh explained it to me later in the careful way he explained things. It was a contest clause, standard language protecting the bequest from challenge, but her specific version had been drafted with unusual attention to a particular scenario, executors who might confuse their administrative role with ownership. She had discussed it with him explicitly when the will was drawn up. She had known my parents. She had known, and she had prepared for it, and she had left me not just a house, but a shield I hadn't known I was carrying. I sat down on the floor of the closet with the book in my lap and let myself cry, not the controlled, careful crying I'd done in hospital bathrooms or in Mrs. Aldridge's guest room, but real crying, the kind that had been waiting for years. I cried for the house and the ring and the garden. I cried for the woman who had sat with me on the porch and told me to be honest. I cried because I had spent so long trying to keep the peace that I had nearly let them keep everything else. When I was finished, I wiped my face and sat in the quiet. The house held the silence the way old houses do, full and familiar, like the memory of someone you loved. I put the book on the shelf where it belonged. I moved in on a Saturday in early spring. I didn't arch a smart into her wine, For furniture from the apartment, my grandmother's kitchen table, the quilt from Mrs. Aldridge's guest room that she insisted I keep. I set things up slowly, in no particular order, letting the house absorb me at whatever pace felt right. That first evening, I made coffee and carried it out to the screened porch. I bought a new rocking chair, not the same as my grandmother's, but close enough in proportion that it fit the space. I sat in it and watched the yard darken and the first stars come through. My phone was inside. No calls to return tonight. I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, the one who'd rescheduled difficult conversations and told herself there would be a better moment later. The one who'd learned to be small so that someone else could be large. The one who'd kept records for months and almost never used them, waiting for a moment that wouldn't come. She wasn't gone. I could feel her around the edges of myself, the habits of her, the reflexes. She'd learned what she'd learned for reasons, and I wasn't interested in being hard on her, but I wasn't her anymore. There's a version of this story that ends with anger, with every grievance tallied and settled by the scale. I understand why people want that version. It's satisfying in a particular way. Clean, final, mathematical. What I have instead is a porch and a rocking chair in a garden I'm learning. What I have is $34,000 in an account with my name on it, and a ring on my finger that belonged to the woman who taught me to be honest, and the memory of Gerald Marsh's voice on the phone saying I can help with this. What I have is the knowledge that the quiet thing I did, the records, the folder, the patience, was the loudest thing I ever did. Louder than anything I could have screamed across a kitchen or across a conference table. My grandmother used to say that freedom needs a backup plan. She built mine before I knew I'd need it. For a long time, I thought obedience was what kept my family together. What I know now is that it only kept them comfortable. Those aren't the same thing, and understanding the difference is maybe the most important thing I've ever done. I sipped my coffee. The yard was fully dark now, the stars clear and closed the way they get in spring, after the winter haze burns off. I wasn't waiting for anything. I was just here, in a house that was mine, on a porch that was mine, in a life that I was finally, fully, irreversibly choosing. They thought the quiet ones never push back. They forgot that quiet is where you keep your proof.